because in reality, they either go outside or they come inside. Yeah, it's just a lot of work. So, yeah. All right. So the Persian Empire. Hello. Hakuna Matata. All right. So with this, what we want to start talking about, Persia is not a place that you have probably covered much, if at all, in your academic career. Oftentimes the Middle East, much like Egypt and, much like Africa, I should say, as well as China, kind of gets left out. And so a lot of this will be very new for you. And I like that. I like that we are learning things. So let's talk a little bit about the Persian Empire. So a little bit about the background. Where we will be starting pretty much is after 1200 BC. So not as old as some of the other societies we've discussed. So in the scheme of that part of the universe, it's a little newer, but still. So around 1200 BC. So civilizations in the East are going to be transformed because of iron. Iron is going to replace bronze. Iron is going to replace bronze. And it's going to replace it in things like tools and weaponry. Now, the group that kind of first is going to make good of that, who is going to be kind of the first group to utilize that, as you will, is going to be particularly your Hittites, who we talked about before. They're kind of the first group, and they do this around 1430 BC, where they utilize bronze, where the other groups had just strictly stuck with iron. They're going to use bronze. All right, however, until the rise of Persia, an empire with origin starting around 612 BC, we don't see this in quite the same fashion. So the Near East remained divided amongst several powers. Before that point, Egypt has recovered its independence. Remember, they go back and forth between these different kingdoms when different groups are coming in and taking over them, much like the Axum took over for a little while. And so at this point, Egypt has reacquired its freedom. And so basically, the Babylonians have rebuilt Babylon. So the Babylonians have rebuilt Babylon. So it's back up and running. And so we are starting to see these big changes around the time that we're going to see Persia come onto the scene. So, and so from this, it's going to form New Babylon. So who are the Persians? Well, they're Indo-Europeans. They're Indo-Europeans. Indo, I-N-D-O, European, be familiar with. So your Persian people are Indo-Europeans. Yay, I got my shirt in here. All right, and so with this, there are a series of tribes that are scattered throughout the southwest of Iran. When you hear the term Persia, think about Iran. I actually think I was in college the first time I realized that Iran and Persia were the same place. To tell you about that particular moment, because I'm sure you are all riveted by this story, I came from a very small community, and it was other than basically black and white. We had very little minority. My friend Adriana and her family were the only Hispanic family that I remember. And of course, I remember Adriana because we were friends, and we stayed the night at each other's house. So that was very normal for me. And I remember one guy coming to our school that was of Chinese descent, and that's really it. We just didn't have a lot of ethnic diversity. Occasionally we'd get an exchange student maybe, but I never had really met someone Well, that's not true, actually. I only knew one family from the Middle East. There was one Indian kid in our school, Indian as in family from India, and his family owned a motel, which is kind of a stereotype of Indian families in the U.S. And then there was, here's Nandu, but the only person I knew from the Middle East was a guy by the name of Mitch Magani, and his mom was my piano teacher, which if you've heard me talk about the Iran hostage crisis, they're kind of connected in that. But anyway, other than that, I'd never met anybody from the Middle East, and I never realized that Iran was Persia. And so when I was in college, there was this first time I had ever met someone who was Muslim. And this young lady, she wore the headdress and for a little while, and then she just kind of got tired of it because literally no one else did at the campus. And so one day she just shows up with this beautiful long curly hair and and didn't wear it because she didn't have to because of not being in a country that required it. And so that was the first time I'd ever been around anyone. And I asked her, I said, where are you from? And she said, Persia. And I remember thinking, okay, where is Persia? And I never thought about it. Well, Persia and Iran are the same thing. And so what begins to happen here with this group of people? Well, for the most part, they're the same thing. Ethnically, they are related to the people who are kind of over that area. And so they settled here on the Iranian plateau. Traditionally, their homeland was a little further away in places like Fars and Zagros. I doubt you are familiar with those cities. So just to kind of expose you to the names there. A lot of these people came out of the mountain ranges, but as we know, as civilization starts to grow, that's what's going to happen. So a lot came out of the mountain ranges. In 550 BC, the Persians near Fars were dominated by a group of people called the Medes. The Medes. I have no idea why we are at Very Presidential, but it's a great podcast if you're looking for one. So that's fun. It's the homecoming shirts. They're coming to get me. Oh, I bet I know what we did. I bet we jumped to Internet Explorer. That's what it was. All right. So the people who are going to get involved here are going to be the Medes, M-E-D-E-S. The Medes are out of the Median Empire. So that will be the people that begin to lord over them. And so the Medes are going to settle on the plains. Now, in 550, the Persian leader Cyrus the Great is going to defeat the Median king named Astyages. And so Astyages is defeated by Cyrus. So to kind of give you the two big names here. And so because Cyrus defeats him, he is going to seize a very important Median city, which is actually their royal city, and that is Ecbatana. And it is E-C-B-A-T-A-N-A. How many of you have heard of any of these places? Because we don't really study this, right? And so he seizes their royal capital, basically. So this would be for us like him taking over D.C. For Britain, it would be like taking over London, Paris, taking over France. You get the point here.
Wait,
and so
that was the Medes, or was that?
That was the Medes' royal capital, was Ecbatana. It's right here. And so this is like their main city. And so because he seats that capital, Cyrus is therefore going to rule both the Medes and the Persian people. And so some things that he's going to do in the decades and the time that follows. Some things that he will do in the time that follows. Why does it do this? Okay. All right. So he will oversee a military campaign. Now, the purpose of this military campaign is expansion. Usually when you have military campaigns, it is either because people are trying to take over you, but that's not as much of a campaign. That's usually more of a defense. A campaign is when you're going trying to win something, just like a campaign for office. You are trying to acquire. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, is this Cyrus?
This is Cyrus. Yeah, we're done with Estriagus. We are now at just Cyrus. Cyrus is going to be dominating here. And so he's going to go all the way from Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, if you will, all the way to India and Syria and Palestine. So he covers massive amounts of land in the Middle East. Pretty much everything that we basically consider Middle East, adding on India, he had. So he develops a very large kingdom. The Persians then conquered Egypt shortly before Cyrus is going to die, which will put Persia, this is supposed to be an illustration of Cyrus the Great. Notice his wings here. And he is going to be replaced by his son, Camses. King Camses is going to be his son. So shortly after he conquers Egypt, his son is going to come in and re-establish control, if you will. All right. The victory here for Camses, he is going to have a big victory in 525 BC, and he will unite the entire Near East, what we today consider the Middle East, into a single empire.
When?
525 BC. And that empire is what we will call the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire. All right. So what is the Persian Empire? First of all, it represents kind of a combination of Near East political and cultural traditions under a government that achieves stability. So a combination, a synthesis of Near Eastern political and cultural traditions under a government that achieves stability, not solely through military terror. So to kind of put that into perspective for you, the government of the Middle East is going to take over, and then they respect the cultures of each other at this point. Now, when you think about Middle East today, it is not exactly known for having large amounts of camaraderie and congruity with each other. But here we do see that. We see a greater tolerance. We see a lot of flexibility. So to give you some examples of this, because that's a pretty big claim. Again, we think Middle East, tolerance is not the word to come to mind. The Jews were allowed to return to their homeland and rebuild provincial centers. The Jews were allowed to return to their homeland and rebuild provincial centers. So that's a huge change. A second huge change, aside from allowing the Jewish people to go back to their homeland that you're also going to see, you also see the Persians allowing different people cultural and religious autonomy. So they could keep their culture, They can keep their religion. However, there's one thing they have to do. They have to pay their taxes. Can't blame them on that. I mean, the empire can't run for free, right? So you got to pay taxes. You can keep your culture, you can keep your religion, but you got to pay your taxes. And so how do they pay their taxes? Well, they pay their taxes through agricultural produce and through precious metals. Through agricultural produce and through precious metals. And those precious metals were generally silver. Precious metals and agricultural produce. So basically, you can be whatever religion you want to be. You can have whatever culture you want to have. But the rule is you have to pay taxes. Pay your taxes, and you do you. And lastly, there is one other thing. You better not rebel. You better not rebel. Now, there's an old expression, you may have heard this in movies and different things, and it was, when you rebel or when you do what you're not supposed to do, they say they'll bring the hammer. In other words, like something's going to come down on you. It's going to be hard and harsh. And that's kind of the thing here. You rebel, it's a different ballgame. All right. So the Persians preferred working their established local institutions to advance their own interests. Because if people are happy and people are working, they're making money, they're paying taxes. So Cambius is going to be followed up with Darius the Great. Darius the Great. Now, Darius is kind of an interesting figure. He basically represents the height of imperial government. Now, anytime we use the term imperial, what does that have to do with? Go back to your U.S. history class in your head. What does imperialism, imperial, what is that about? What?
Conquering.
Yes. Expanding one's influence. Absolutely. Thank you. The government during his reign was centered in Fars. Again, spelled just like it says, Fars, F-A-R-S. And so Fars had a great fortress or palace there. And quite frankly, if you are going to be the lord over a group who very well may be attacked by others, that's kind of where you want to live anyway, is a fortified place. So the government under Darius the Great or Darius the First was absolute. What does that mean?
King had all the power.
Yes. Government was also hereditary. What does that mean?
It was passed down through the family.
Very good. So that means that, and we see this theme so many times in all these ancient civilizations. And that's one thing I say this a lot that I think is really neat, is how we see it repeat in all these different areas of the world. So hereditary means if you're the king, then your kid's going to be the king, and then his kid's going to be the king, and then his kid, and his kid, and his kid. So the king, this monarchy is hereditary. However, there's a little catch to it in the Persian realm. Persian kings could choose their own successor from their royal family. Persian kings could choose their own successors from their royal family. And you see this, do I know?
So it's not firstborn?
It doesn't have to be the firstborn. You see this some in different Middle Eastern societies, like with the Jewish faith, if you know much about the story of David and then Solomon, who will follow up his father, Solomon was not the second-born child. David had other children. Of course, there's a whole story about his older son, Absalom, who just kind of really screws things up and has long hair. But anyway, you see this oftentimes in certain cultures where the firstborn was considered to kind of have the blessing, But sometimes with ruling, he did not always get that position. And of course, notice we're still saying he. So, But you don't see this, like, that wasn't very common in Europe, but we do see it in the Middle East. Have any of you, have any of you seen the show Tyrant? It's I don't even know what channel it comes from, but it's one on Hulu that my husband has been watching. It's about this guy in the Middle East that his dad was like this major ruler, and his brother was there to be the follow-up, and he came to the U.S. to become a doctor. And anyway, so it kind of shows the same thing, that ruling isn't always handed down in the Middle East to the firstborn son. However, it is going to be someone in the family. The king was also assisted by a court of hereditary nobles. Again, that's kind of a trend too, isn't it? Think about with England, you have the House of Lords, and those positions are passed down. So if you remember the House of Lords, then usually your, at that time, then usually your relative would take your space. And we talked about, especially if you took A-Push with me, we talked about how certain titles like Lord Baltimore, when you died, somebody else became Lord Baltimore, not to be confused with Baltimore. So there you go. All right. So Darius is going to build canals. He builds canals. He's very interesting. He builds underground waterways. I think that's pretty fascinating. That in the BC time period, this guy is building like these underground water tunnels that you would take your ships in. He also builds a powerful navy. Further improved and expanded the networks of roads and way stations throughout the empire. So basically, he developed a nice system of travel. A nice system of travel. And also, along with this system of travel, he had places that were designated so authorized travelers, could draw daily provisions. So it was almost kind of like rest stops. So as a traveler, you would know there was a specific place designed for you if you were authorized by the king to travel. So you didn't have to worry about finding shelter. I think that's kind of just very modern, actually. Very modern concept. By the way, I found it funny. Every time there's a tropical storm or hurricane or anything like that in Mobile, it's kind of a big joke that somebody will release this picture that will say the Wallace Tunnel in Mobile is already underwater.
Oh, I get it.
Because it's literally underwater, and people will start saying, no, the tunnel's already underwater, and they start freaking out, and you're like, but it's always underwater. So, yeah, good times. But it made me think of that when talking about the building the canals. So let's talk about what are the satraps. I don't think we've talked about satraps before. All right, so let's talk about the satraps. The satraps are people who represented the king to the provinces. These people who represented the king to the provinces.
Like those people in those movies that like get off their horse and they like leave the scroll or whatever?
Something like that, yes. So they would come to these different systems, and they weren't necessarily like the governor, but they were like the king's person. And I think that's actually a pretty good synopsis of them, Kirsten. They're the guy that was like, I'm here from the king, that's their job. And so they were called the satraps. So a little bit about these servants to the king. Basically, areas that were only nominally under Persian control, such as the Arabs, were not linked through satraps. So basically, he did not send satraps to kind of watch over those places because they were places that he knew he was most likely to lose and he really wasn't willing to fight for, if that makes sense. They were not some of his most important. And what he would do is instead, those places, he would give them a little more self-rule because the more freedom you have, the less you have to rebel to. Does that make sense? You know, someone we know actually was talking about how, my child never gets mad at me. And I'm like, yeah, you never told him no a day in your life. No wonder they never get mad at you, And so this is kind of with the satraps. So a place that you're trying to execute more control over, you would have satraps. So what did it mean to be a satrap? Well, the king, his family, and nobility favored subjects, the people who the king favored, as well as his family and the nobles, would own large estates throughout the empire. And if you had the choice to own a large estate or not own a large estate, generally this was the one you wanted to have. Almost think about like what the lords and the serf relationships that you would have like in Europe. It's kind of the same thing. So on top of having these satraps, he also had imperial inspectors that would monitor the satraps. Because you could have somebody very corrupt telling you that the king wants this and the king wants that when the king did not.
So they inspected the satraps?
They would kind of go to check up on the satraps to make sure the satraps are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Also, imperial control, keeping control of these empires, was a very delicate balance that rested on the relationship between the satraps and the locals. So you had to make sure that everybody was kind of playing their role, if you will. If the satraps aren't keeping control, then you got a problem. If the satraps exercise too much control, you have another problem. So you see the trend here, right? Okay, so a little bit about commerce. So it was important to keep a healthy relationship between the satraps and the elites. Because if that happened, commerce could be stimulated. And a growing commerce means more tax dollars, right? And tax dollars means that the country can do, or the area can do what it needs to do. This also meant that trade routes could be guarded throughout the empire. For instance, we've talked, especially in the other class for some reason, they always talk about walking to their cars by themselves. It's kind of funny. But kind of a recurring theme we have in there. However, if you've ever been out, at night somewhere, and it's late, and there are a lot of other people there, we don't tend to be afraid, do we? Because things are less likely to happen in large groups of people, right? Not like packed crowd type things, but, when it becomes scary is when you're by yourself or practically by yourself. And so the more those roads are being used, the more their network is exercising, kind of the more stable their trade becomes. And so also to make this more effective, it is going to be through these networks that the Persians introduced the idea of coinage. What do we mean by coinage? Coins, absolutely. Simple enough. Now, they were not the first group to make coins. This is their imperial coin. I think it's pretty cool, actually. This was a Lydian tradition. It had been done before, but they really are the first ones that massively do it with trade. And as you know, not 100% true, but for the most part, our money is valuable because we believe it's valuable and other people believe it's valuable. All right? That's what makes our bills valuable. At one point, we were on the gold system. We are not anymore necessarily. And so what makes it valuable is that people trust it to have value. If they did not trust it to have value, we would, it would be worthless. So another thing that's very significant that comes out of this is going to be the world's postal service. The postal service. Now, this is very interesting. With these trade routes, they are going to develop the most efficient postal service the world had seen up until that point. So a post is basically where that term comes from, is where something was written to be sent to someone else. And so you would take something, you would write it, basically letters. And of course now I kind of find it funny how life goes full circle, how we call, like if you have a class discussion or something like we use and you write on that, we call it your toast. And that dates all the way back to here. So Herodotus, who is a famous historian of this era, the most famous historian of this era, his name is spelled Heroduts. I've mentioned him a couple times. He makes this famous statement about the couriers. And I love this because if you've ever heard this before, it is because it is the motto of the U.S. Postal Service. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed routes. And so our Postal Service and its motto is based on that. And so basically, he coins that about them, or writes that about them, and that becomes the phrase that we still use to define the Postal Service today.
And it's very true because my parents had to work in the hurricane.
Yeah, and it is always fun times when you work in the hurricane. In fact, I noticed Sunday, I think it was, our Postal Service was coming around in Mobile and doing some delivery, I guess, where they were backed up. And they usually don't work on Sundays. So, yeah. All right. So, under the Emperor Cyrus, the Persians built a 1,500-mile road. It's going to go from Sardis, which is in Asia Minor over here, all the way to Susa. From Sardis in Asia Minor to the Persian capital at Susa. At the time of its building, it was called the Royal Road, and it was the longest road in the world at that time. So, big deal. Longest road in the world at this current time. All right. Some things about this Royal Road, even when compared to the interstate highways today, it is impressive. So to give you a statistic here, Interstate 75 runs from Canada to the border there in Michigan, all the way to the southern end of Florida. It is barely as long as this. So from the top of the U.S. all the way to the tip of Florida, it is barely as long as this. All right. So with this, one of the few U.S. interstates longer than the Royal Road is I-180, and it is the interstate that runs from New York to San Francisco. I would assume about as long as probably I-10 has to be close. It is 2,500 miles, and so it is one of the few that is longer. So there you go. All right. The Royal Road made possible one of the world's first postal systems, and along it lay some 80 different way stations, where one horsebound mail carrier could pass the mail on to another. And so basically, it's kind of like the Pony Express that we're going to see in the West in the 1860s. However, we are in Persia in like 400 BC. Pretty impressive. Mail to the Persian Empire, however, was not just for anyone. So this doesn't mean that you're sitting around waiting for your grandma to send you a birthday card, okay? Actually, it was only for the king and his important leaders. Only for the king and those important leaders. And with that, these people would be like the satraps. And so that way there was this really steady road that they could communicate with the king quickly, because that's what they're looking for, right? It's quick communication with the king. The idea of ordinary people being able to mail letters did not take hold until the 1600s in England. For one reason, how many ordinary people could probably even communicate through writing at that time? You know, probably very few of them had the skills to do that because it just wasn't a very common practice. So a little bit about the Persian religion. So in the Persian religion, we're going to talk about Zoroaster. So the King of Kings refrains from calls of divinity. So the kings here, they refuse to be called divine, but they stress that they are divinely appointed. So in other words, they are not gods. Remember, the Egyptians thought they were gods. The pharaohs did. They don't believe they're gods, but they believe they were chosen by gods. So the great god was my favorite god name here, Ahura Mazda. So they believed the great god to be Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda was the wise lord. And he set the Persian king over the very lands that he was in control of. So that would be the job of Ahura Mazda. So some things that are original about the Persian religion that we're going to get into with Zoroaster here is it broke from Near Eastern traditions of religion. It's different than what's going on in the Near East. This is something fresh. It doesn't seem to just be an offshoot of what they had. But Zoroastrianism is going to be a huge movement here. So what is it? It's an intellectual doctrine of ethics centered around Ahura Mazda. Occasionally, guys, you will see Ahura Mazda spelled a couple of ways, and it's just because you're transitioning between two different languages and different types of characters. So sometimes you will see it, if you're looking some of this up, H-U-U-A-R-A, Mazda. But sometimes you see it as well with just the A-H-U-R-A. So just so you see it both ways in case you're trying to do some research on it. But anyway, a little bit about Zoroastrianism. Did you guys cover that at all in World Religions? Mm-hmm. Probably not. It's a little older. You see some influences in it of certain types of Judaism. So under Zoroaster, it promoted ethical monotheism. So monotheism, the belief in one God, which is Ahura Mazda, and it is based on ethics. It is based on certain values in society, if you will, mores, social mores. And so under Zoroaster, he is going to promote this belief, and he challenged the old Iranian belief that the world was ruled by a horde of supernatural beings. So before this time, the people of Iran thought that there was just a group of supernatural beings, almost like, I think about, why can't I think of his name? It's like the superheroes. I think about like the superheroes, like Thor, that's what I was looking for. You know, this idea that these supernatural beings have come to Earth, and pretty much it's just, we're kind of at their whim. And so that was kind of the older beliefs of Iran. And so this is a different idea. Over the centuries after his death, Zoroastrianism became a dualistic faith that incorporated older Iranian gods. So they're like, yeah, we still believe Ahura Mazda is the big guy. But let's include all those other guys too while we're at it. Those gods were lesser deities. So in other words, they were not as significant as Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda was the big G. They were the little G's. All right. So with this, So with this dualistic faith, they eventually elevated an evil god, and that is going to be, I don't know if I have him on here or not. I don't. Okay, so the evil god is going to be Ahriman. It is Ahriman. So he's kind of like your devil figure, if you will. So you have Ahura Mazda and you have Ahriman. And so he is elevated to a position that is equal to that of Ahura Mazda. Through these changes, the religion focused on the constant and intensive struggle between good and evil, which is also kind of a common religious theme. If you study world religions, you constantly see that focus on the balance. It's kind of the yin and yang concept, where good and evil is constantly kind of fighting it out to see who's in control. Ahura Mazda was the god of light, goodness, mind, and spirit. Where Ahriman was a different kind of god. He was of darkness and evil and matter, like literally matter, like the substance that makes up all things, because they viewed the material world and the human body as both evil. And so because of that, that is why he would be the god of matter. So the spiritual world, as well as the human soul, which is inside the human body, were good, where the body and the things that we can touch, the tangible things, are all matter, so therefore they're all evil, right? So you see the kind of the difference in the two. So this faith transcended the Persians and flowed throughout the past the empire to new people, and it actually becomes a universal faith kind of in that area. It remained dominant in Mesopotamia until Islam and their conquest of the 7th century. It has a strong influence over the Jews, over Hellenistic peoples, and over the Romans. So it is something that we see in a lot of the teachings of these other religious groups. We see the influence of Zoroastrianism. All right, so with that, let's reference here Mithras and Mithraism. And so this is kind of an extension. This is the Roman influence of Zoroastrianism. So what is this? Mithras was the lieutenant for Ahura Mazda. So he's like his number 2 guy here. And he becomes a featured god in the Roman pantheon.
Wait, what is he?
Do what, huh?
What is he?
He's a featured god by the Romans.
Oh, what did you say before that? What did you say before that?
He's the lieutenant for Ahura Mazda. And so, who knows what a pantheon is? Ever heard the term pantheon?
Yeah,
Yes, no, maybe? So, pantheon is a, let me write this term over here. I meant to leave it. It is like if you were looking at the whole slate of Greek gods, that would be their pantheon. It's like the whole collection, and it's usually used in reference to the gods. But in case you ever see the term pantheon, it kind of gives you that idea. So Mithras was his number 2 guy. And he becomes a key figure in medieval religion as well, and in medieval thought. So let's talk a little bit about their achievements and their cultural significance. The Persians themselves are going to focus extremely intensely on public works and military accomplishments. And they do so at the expense. Now, when one area flourishes, what happens in another area? Any guesses?
It doesn't do so well.
It doesn't do so well. So basically, guys, there are only so many hours in the day, right? You ever find that sometimes you're like, I don't know how I can get all this done? And the truth is you just can't, because literally, sometimes there are only so many hours in the day. And it becomes an issue, 11:38 to 126. It becomes an issue trying to figure out how do you balance all those things in life. This is just life in general. And what you find sometimes is if you focus all your efforts and all your life on one area, the other areas start to crumble a little bit. I am sure, Sydney, you're still prepping for your junior miss stuff, right?
Saturday and Sunday.
And how much of your life has that occupied over the past several months?
Too much.
And it very much, even with well intentions, it becomes exhausted doing those kind of things because it becomes everything that you have time to focus on. And if it's kind of one of those things that if it's not about that, then at that moment it can't count. And you hate to be that way, but that's what you're going to find. The biggest secret in life, if there is one, is finding balance. And usually when we start to have problems, and this is true, I don't think just for adults, but I see it very strongly in my adult life, is when one area of your life gets out of whack. When you don't take care of your health, then that's going to end up being a problem. When you don't take care of your family and communing with your family, then that becomes a problem. When you don't take care of your work, that becomes a problem. So somewhere in all of those things, sometimes something has to give. And that is what's difficult, is figuring out what matters the most and prioritizing. But anyway, that's a whole nother little life lesson there. So, artistic expression. Because they are so busy working on these public works and conquering places, we are not going to see a lot of progress with artistic expression. We're not going to see a lot of changes with the artistic expression. And so that is an area that we do not move forward, unfortunately, during this period, or that they do not move forward, I guess would be more correct. All right. So let's talk about the literature that is produced, however. There is going to be a small amount of literature that we see produced. All right. Homecoming shirts, the theme of my life right now. Speaking of being out of balance. Okay. Bam. All right. I always love when somebody needs the size that I have. So that's good. All right. So anyway, a little bit of literature that's produced. One of the exceptions to this is Avesta. Avesta. Avesta is a collection of the sacred scriptures of Zoroastrianism. So if you ever hear that somebody mention Avesta, that's like it's not exactly the same as what the Bible or the Quran would be, but it's kind of like a philosophy for life that they have. Because remember, theirs is all about morals and good works and those things. So Avesta is their holy scripture here. And this is a copy, in case you just want to go out and go shopping, looking for a little light reading. Science and math does not advance in their society, much beyond what was inherited from the Babylonians and the Egyptians. So basically, they take what those before them have done, and that's kind of what they go with. We do not see them moving forward with it. For art and architecture, they found inspiration from other cultures, the Greeks, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians. However, it is worth pointing out that their palaces were built for philosophically different reasons than these other cultures. Their palaces were built for philosophically different reasons than these other cultures, but that is where they do find their inspiration. They built their grand projects using man that were for the purpose of man, but not for gods. So you don't see these as like an object of worship, which you're going to see with the Greeks and the Assyrians. And even like the Egyptians and the Babylonians, the Egyptians, we see a lot of like these big, huge tombs that are formed for the purpose of these pharaohs who are transitioning to their godlike status. They're not concerned about that. They believe in celebrating the earthly rulers of their mighty empire. not necessarily celebrating another life to come. So what is their downfall? Well, if you're going to wrap their downfall into one thing, it is pretty simple. And it is going to be basically the failure of their imperial leadership. So Darius the Third, I love the picture of him. The picture, he just looks like he's going to be the screw-up guy, right? I used to love the Far Side. Have you ever looked at any of the Far Side cartoons? They're like a whole series of cartoons. And there's one that it has this guy, and he plays the cymbals in the band. And it looks like it's an orchestra, and you see him in the back, and he has this little thought bubble, and he's going, don't screw up, don't screw up, don't screw up. And the caption at the bottom says, the night Bob screwed up. And, that's kind of how we feel sometimes. And when I see this picture, Darius does not look like things are going to go well for him in this picture. He looks like, uh-oh. So basically, Darius the Third became the leader in 380, and he is the leader into July 330. So, not a short term here. He was originally named, that's not right. Oh, no, that's wrong. Yeah. He was born 380, and he lives to 330. He was originally named Artaxerxes, which I'm not concerned that you know. The Greeks are going to call him Kodamanus. Again, not concerned that you know that. But he is talked about in other empires. He is the last king of this particular empire of Persia. And his actual rule is from 336 to 330. So only a 6-year period. Only a 6-year period. He basically, what's going to take him out is really not as much that he himself is a screw-up, although this picture kind of makes it look like he is. It is that he is going to face someone that is a far greater statistician, soldier, fighter, hero, warrior than he was. And that is a guy who I am sure you've heard of before. And that's Alexander the Great. So in 330, he is defeated by Alexander the Great. And when somebody's named the Great, they're kind of tough to beat. So that is why Darius the First was Darius the Great. Cyrus was Cyrus the Great, but Darius the Third is just kind of Darius the Okay. So, anyway. So a little bit about Alexander's victory. It was not a foregone conclusion that Alexander was going to beat this guy, to be fair. In fact, it is a 12-year campaign for Alexander to take over the entire Persian Empire. So this isn't a walk in the park. 12 years is really longer than any official declared U.S. war has ever lasted. That's a long time. And we will talk about Darius the Third when we talk about Alexander the Great and his conquest. It's kind of nice because we come back to the other side of this and how he takes on Persia. And like I said, Darius doesn't do as badly as it makes it sound or even as the picture makes him look. So kind of lastly, Persia is basically a summation of the age-old Mesopotamian concepts. And kind of with Persia, with the end of Persia, we are going to start to see a transition into Greece and into these other areas where culture and different things are going to flourish and change is going to. And so that is the end of our discussion on Persia. I do have a video for you. So I just kind of like to go back through those and let them reiterate what we established. Let me get this off.